Hello everybody, welcome to today's Path to Enlightenment class delivered to you through the wonders of the internet. I hope everybody is okay and doing well in lockdown. We'll start off with a sad light offering for John Edwards, who was one of the Geshe Loden's original students here in Australia and one of the original directors of the Tibetan Buddhist Society, who passed away early yesterday morning at the age of 93. And so the offering of the lights in the temple, the merit of that is dedicated to the cause that John has a very easy, peaceful time through the intermediate state, that he very quickly achieves a high rebirth, that he encounters our kind teacher, Geshe Acharya Thubten Loden, that his next life is filled with happiness and joy, and that he has all the qualities of a perfect human rebirth, able to practice the Dharma under the guidance of kind teachers, and that he quickly attains. So we'll reflect like that for a short. And I should have mentioned too that light offering and two more light offerings are sponsored by Paul Sokolich, a very long time friend of John. So we'll do the usual prayers. We'll do them just in English today. So beginning with a prayer of praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. Teacher, Bhagawan, Tathagata, Arahant, perfectly pure and complete Buddha, all-knowing, having poise, Sugata, apprehender of the world, navigator of beings to be subdued, incomparable, teacher of gods and humans. To the Buddha, the Bhagawan, the glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, we prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. And then the refuge and bodhichitta prayer. To the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, I go for refuge until becoming enlightened. Through the merit of my generosity and so on, may I achieve Buddhahood to benefit all beings. To the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, I go for refuge until becoming enlightened. Through the merit of my generosity and so on, may I achieve Buddhahood to benefit all beings. To the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, I go for refuge until becoming enlightened. Through the merit of my generosity and so on, may I achieve Buddhahood to benefit all beings. Then the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume and strewn with flowers, Mount Meru, the four continents, adorned with sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered thus, may all beings enjoy such pure lands. The seven-limbed prayer. I prostrate my three doors with a mind of respect and offer all actually arranged and mentally emanated offerings. I reveal all the downfalls and negativities that I have ever collected and rejoice in the virtues of individuals and superiors. Please remain perfectly abiding until samsara is no longer seen. I request you to turn the vast and profound wheels of Dharma. I dedicate the virtues of myself and others to the great enlightenment. Next, the prayer of the lineage of gurus. So reflecting on the qualities of all the lineage teachers from Shakyamuni Buddha himself down to our own kind teacher. Body born from a million magnificent, excellent virtues, speech fulfilling the hopes of infinite beings, a mind that sees all objects of knowledge precisely, I bow my head to the chief among the Shakyas. Supreme sons of the incomparable teacher, carrying the load of all the conqueror's deeds, by their emanations appearing in countless realms, I prostrate to Maitreya and Manjushri. The mother of conquerors is difficult to fathom. The precise thought is in commentaries written by Jambudvipa's ornaments, Nagarjuna and Asanga. I prostrate at the feet of those most renowned in the three realms. From these two great chariots come the excellent lineages of the paths of profound view and vast deeds, their essential points gathered thoroughly and without fault. Prostration to the lamp holding this treasury of instruction. Giving explanation through compassion, by seeing precisely and completely the essential points of all paths of Sutra and Tantra, holder of the conqueror's entire holy Dharma, prostrations to the glorious Losang Dragpa. I, seeing all the infinite teachings, supreme way of crossing for those entering the journey to liberation, moved by compassion to deeds skilled in method, prostrations to the spiritual masters who make everything clear. And then finally, the great treasury of excellence. And again, as we mentioned last week, it's wonderful to maintain as much mindfulness as we can with each line of this verse, because in doing so, we're familiarising ourselves with each step of the path to enlightenment. So in itself is a meditation on the whole of the Lam Rim, the three scopes and so forth, three principal paths, etc. The kind master is the basis of all qualities, and proper alliance is the root of the path. By seeing this excellence and through much striving, bestow blessings to be devoted with great respect. This gentle support of freedom, obtained this one time, is most difficult to achieve. Knowing its great value gives rise to a mind seizing its essence constantly day and night. Bestow blessings to generate this continuum unceasingly. It is like a bubble in water, this constantly moving body and life. Thus remember the swift collapse of death. Beyond death, like body and shadow, white and black karmic results follow after. By gaining firm certainty in this, the mass of faults, subtle and very subtle, are abandoned, and the accomplishment of all virtuous collections completed. Bestow blessings to ever retain conscientiousness. The qualities of samsara are unfit to be trusted, the door to all suffering. Do not be content with these enjoyments. By knowing its defects, bestow blessings to develop a great aspiration for the bliss of liberation. By that pure thought, great conscientiousness is drawn forth, and mindfulness and awareness of the individual liberation, the root of the teachings. Bestow blessings to make this the essential practice. Just as I myself have fallen into samsara's ocean, all living beings as mother are also like that. By seeing the responsibility for the liberation of beings, bestow blessings to be trained in supreme bodhichitta. However, by merely generating the mind, if not acquainted with the three aspects of ethics, enlightenment will not be attained. By seeing this excellence, bestow blessings to train with strong effort in the vows of conqueror sons. Pacifying distraction toward perverse objects, by way of proper analysis of the perfect meaning, bestow blessings to swiftly and continuously generate the path related to the union of calm abiding and special insight. Thus, becoming a vessel trained in the common paths, enter the Vajrayana, supreme evolution of all vehicles. Bestow blessings to engage the easy path itself, that sacred way of crossing for fortunate beings. The base of practice for the true aspect of attainment is when guarding the pure vows of commitment is found to be genuine and certain. Bestow blessings to protect them, even at risk of life. Then, by understanding properly the important points, which are the essence of the 2 stages of the Tantra classes, bestow blessings to practice according to these holy teachings, with continuous effort in the supreme 4-session yoga. Like that, may the spiritual friend revealing the gentle path and the friends of proper practice stand firm. Bestow blessings to quickly pacify the masses of outer and inner hindrances. In all rebirths, may I never be parted from perfect gurus and the enjoyment of the glorious Dharma. By utterly completing all qualities, paths and grounds, may I quickly achieve the state of Vajradhara. So last week we did a brief recap over the preliminary sections of the Path to Enlightenment in Tibetan Buddhism that have been covered by Anna and Pam since the start of the year. So we talked a bit about the outline in the back of the book and explained why it's important, so that in familiarising ourselves with the structure of the text. Mentioned that the outline has 4 high-level divisions and that we're currently moving through the 4th of those 4 high-level divisions, that is the actual instruction, leading the disciple through the actual instruction, which comprises by far the largest section of the Path to Enlightenment. That begins with the initial subjects of Guru Yoga and leisure and fortune, or the perfect human rebirth. And once those subjects have completed, there's a very important heading or subsection, and in the outline this is on page 915, or in the text itself it begins at 218, and that heading is the means for taking the essence of leisure and fortune. In the immediate previous chapter, Geshe has explained the importance of leisure and fortune, the value of our current situation of leisure and fortune, both temporarily and ultimately and moment by moment. And now having set the resolve to seize the essence of the life of leisure and fortune, this next section, and in fact the rest of the Path of Enlightenment, tells us how to do that. Tells us how to actually extract the essence of the life of leisure and fortune. And then underneath that, again, there are 2 major sections. The first is, it's called Acquiring Conviction Regarding General Aspects of the Path. But what that really does is to explain the 3 scopes according to which the rest of the teachings of the Path to Enlightenment are organised. And those 3 scopes are the paths of small scope, the path of medium scope, and the path of great scope. So in other words, the actual way of taking the essence of our life of leisure and fortune is to practice the 3 scopes. The small scope, where we're starting off, so we talked about the fact that the small scope teachings are aimed at enabling us to achieve higher status or happiness in future lives. So Geshe explains that there are 2 types of small scope being. So the first type of small scope being are those who seek to use the practices for greater happiness or achievement, success in this life, whereas the second type are those whose aspiration is to achieve greater happiness in future lives. And it's only the second of these that is actually a practitioner of the path of small scope. So in order to realise the path of small scope, then we would need to have the genuine to actually realise, to have the realisation of the path of a small scope, then we would need to genuinely hold the heartfelt aspiration to benefit our future lives, and for that to be a stronger priority, a more urgent priority than our happiness, our success, our achievement in this current life. And as we said last week, that's a very considerable achievement in itself. Of course, all of the practices of the path of enlightenment in any of the scopes will actually improve, also bring about benefit in this life. It will help us to experience greater peace, greater contentment. It will open our heart. It will enable us to develop greater wisdom. In order for it to be at least a small scope practice, though, it means that our objective for achieving those qualities primarily is to achieve the benefit in future lives. That is, we're bringing a longer term focus or a longer term objective to our practice. So genuinely, and apologies to anybody who might have that realisation, but genuinely for most of us as beginners, that in itself is something that's one of the things that we're working on as part of our practice, to generate the wisdom and understanding that makes that longer term aspiration more genuine and more real to us until it is actually a realisation, which would be the criterion of having achieved the realisations of the small scope. So the way the small scope teachings themselves are divided up, so if on page 223 there's an outline of the small scope teachings, and the main body of the explanation is under the first heading, the actual training, and that has two major parts. So the first is developing the aspiration for benefiting future lives, and the second is the actual methods for achieving happiness in future existences. So the first two subjects, meditating on death, meditating on the suffering and happiness of the two types of being, their function is to strengthen our aspiration to benefit our future life. So in a way, it's carrying forward some of the themes that were that Geshe Loden has already covered in the explanation of the life of leisure and fortune. The second part, once we've used those first sections to develop our aspiration to benefit future lives, then the second part of the actual training of the small scope shows the actual methods by which we achieve happiness in future existence. And the two subjects that are explained there are going for refuge and faith in karma, or practicing karma. But we're still back in the first, so we're talking about how we develop our aspiration to benefit our own future existence. And there are two subjects underneath that. Firstly, meditating on death, which is covered in chapter 8 of the text, and secondly, meditating on the suffering and happiness of the two types of being. So, as we said last week, Pam, in her final class, ran through Geshe Loden's explanation of the meditation on death, and in particular, how that leads on from our understanding of the teachings of the life of leisure and fortune. So if we practice the subject of leisure and fortune, so we apply our wisdoms of listening, thinking, and meditation to that subject, and develop a really strong intuitive sense of the value of our current life, and in particular, the primary value of our current life is that it enables us to take control of our future happiness and existence by practicing Dharma, by using the Dharma methods to cultivate states of mind that are going to support our future happiness, and to reduce and finally eliminate states of mind that are harmful to our future states of existence. So if we practice leisure and fortune, then we gain a really strong realization, a conviction that we are in an extraordinary fortunate situation, and that we can use the situation that we're currently in order to achieve absolutely extraordinary benefit. That we have this wonderful potential to benefit both ourselves and others, and the best thing that we could do with this life, without question, is to develop that potential. And that in order to do that, because our life of leisure and fortune is valuable not only temporarily, not only ultimately, but it's also valuable moment by moment, that there's not one moment of our current life that we can't apply to the objective of achieving enlightenment. There's not one moment of our life that doesn't have the potential to bring great benefit to ourselves and others. I can remember one teacher commenting once that if we have the realization of leisure and fortune, it would be impossible ever to experience depression, for example, because we would have an intuitive realization from our heart that we are in the most extraordinarily favourable and fortunate position. That when we compare our situation with that of innumerable other living beings, at the moment we've hit the jackpot. So there is actually, aside from actually having realizations of the path to enlightenment, there's no more fortunate position that we could be in. So as we progressively develop this realization, then that also increases our joy and energy in our practice. However, the first subject on the path of a small scope, meditating on death, reminds us that this opportunity that we currently have is a product, and so therefore it's impermanent. That step by step, the causes that support and sustain our current 8 freedoms and 10 endowments will expire, and when they do and our life ends, then the current opportunity that we have will end with our life, and we have no certainty about what our next life will be like. So therefore, we need to understand that our life is impermanent. We need to become aware that our death is certain, that the time of death is completely uncertain, and to recognise that the only thing that will benefit us at the time of death are our own wisdom, our own good heart, our own realisations of the path to enlightenment. Those are the only things that we will experience as meaningful and helpful at the time of our death. Everything else, all of our possessions, everything we've done, everywhere we've been, all of our plans, all of our family, all of that is history. At that point, the only thing that's going to be that will be of benefit to us will be our good heart, our wisdom, our inner peace, our compassion, our love, and so forth. And the means of developing those is the practice of path to enlightenment. So, chapter 9 of the path to enlightenment, which is entitled Lower Rebirths, and Geshe segues into this on page 253. And the general comment that he makes about the small scope teachings, and probably particularly about the subjects of death and impermanence and of the lower realms, is he says, at this stage of the graduated path, the intention is not to develop blissful states of mind. Rather, by realising impermanence, you'll be strongly motivated to practice the Dharma and will develop the energy to make the progress on the graduated path. This is a strong foundation for all advanced practices. So Geshe makes that statement about the meditation on death and impermanence, but it's equally true of the subject of lower rebirths that Geshe begins in chapter 9. And that's because wherever we are reborn, so whether so whether it's in a higher rebirth or a lower rebirth, then we need to recognise the pitfalls and of being in that type of existence. So Geshe Loden talks about these two types of rebirth on page 258, where he explains the two major divisions of the explanation of rebirth. So this is about on the middle of the page, and he mentions the two divisions, which are firstly meditating on the suffering and happiness of the two types of being, and secondly, about a third of the way from the bottom, meditating on the suffering of the lower realms. Meditating on the suffering and happiness of the two types of being, the two types of being are firstly those who have relative happiness, those who are currently or in future are reborn in higher states or higher realms, that have lives that predominantly have positive qualities and good conditions. The second type of beings are those who experience the greater suffering and greater difficulty in the lower states or the lower realms, as Geshe Loden calls them. So we might think that what's the problem with the first? Why should we have any concern about having relative happiness in higher states or realms? And from a small scope perspective, if we're not looking beyond the small scope, then we mightn't even ask that question. But in the teachings on the medium scope, Geshe Loden explains that the reason that we need to also understand the position of beings who experience the lives in the higher states or realms is that enables us to understand the faults of psychic existence in general. So when we get to the teachings on the medium scope, which Geshe Loden begins in part 4 of Path to Enlightenment, he explains why even being born in a high state, such as a human rebirth or a higher than human rebirth, why that in itself is also not ideal, because it's still pervaded by the faults of psychic existence. But here we're talking about the small scope, and so our immediate focus and our immediate aim is to avoid a lower rebirth and to achieve high status. And so in this chapter here, the lower realms are explained in some detail. So we might have an initial response in contemplating or approaching the teaching. So the teachings in the lower realms set out sometimes in graphic detail the types of unbelievably suffering experience that that beings in the lower realms undergo. So we might wonder, why would we do that? Why would we go out of our way to focus on the great suffering of beings in certain states of existence, or on the fact that we might even experience that type of suffering in future? In a lot of ways, that goes against our basic instincts. So generally, we don't like thinking about unpleasant things, and particularly unpleasant things that to us in our current situation seem theoretical. They're not problems that are facing us right now. So we can think, well, what's really the point of doing this? So there's a whole chapter here on the unbelievable suffering of the lower realms. Why would I read about that? Why would I meditate on that? Whatever might happen in future, in this life at the moment, things go up and down a little bit, but basically they're okay. So what is the point of me even contemplating the types of suffering that other living beings might be experiencing, going way, way beyond any current human suffering. The point of it basically is to avoid that suffering. So from the point of view of the path to enlightenment, each of us has the potential to be reborn in a higher realm with extraordinary happiness, extraordinary joy, extraordinary good conditions, and we also have the potential to be reborn in a lower state with extraordinary, with conditions that if we were to be presented with them now, would just seem inconceivable suffering, inconceivably terrifying. So the point of contemplating these teachings is recognizing that we have the cause, we all have the cause of that type of experience to neutralize and ultimately to eliminate the possibility of achieving that type of suffering in a future rebirth. We might also think, well, isn't it kind of unhealthy to even be contemplating something? It can sound like a horror movie. Why would I actually go out of my way to actively imagine being in a situation of extraordinary suffering? Why would I go out of my way to generate the experience of fear and anxiety? Isn't meditation about settling down, relaxing, generating a state of inner peace, inner calm, and so forth? Well, as Geshe said before, the purpose of these immediate teachings isn't especially to generate peaceful, blissful states of mind. It is to develop our wisdom and to develop our motivation to practice. Still, we do need to be sensible with the way that we approach these teachings. So many people we know have had trauma in their lives. Any of us at any time, as we know, can have fragile mental health. We need to be familiar with our own mind. We need to know what is useful and beneficial for us at any given time. And it may well be that there are times in our life when this type of meditation would not be advised. However, its purpose is to motivate us, it is to energize us, so at the right time, it's certainly part of our practice of the path to enlightenment. If at a particular time it doesn't motivate us, it doesn't energize us, it actually paralyzes us, well, at that point, it's not useful. On the other hand, if we familiarize ourselves with these teachings, well, then it also builds our mental strength and resilience. More fundamentally, I guess you might say that opening our mind to the question of our long-term future, to the possibility of what might happen at the end of this life, is a positive and healthy thing to be doing. How could it be negative to at least contemplate that possibility? We're definitely going to die. We already have received extensive teachings on that in Chapter 8 of the Path to Enlightenment. We certainly don't know when we're going to die. Could be at the ripe old age of 93. It could be next week. It could be in the next 10 minutes. We simply have no way of knowing when our current life of leisure and fortune will come to an end and we have to face a radically different situation. When that does happen, and it will happen, so when that happens, what are the possibilities? What type of situation could we find ourselves in at the end of this life? To think, and so again, we might have a number of different ways of dealing with this. So if we're asked the question, well, what's going to happen at the end of my life? One reaction might be, well, I couldn't possibly know, could I? So what's the point of thinking about it? But again, that's not a helpful attitude. And if we analyse, we can see that it's not what we work, it's not the way that we generally approach other uncertainties or other questions about our long-term future in this life. So, for example, when we're young, we don't really have any idea what type of work situation we're going to end up in. But we don't simply say, well, when I'm 18, I don't really know what type of work situation I'm going to be in, so what I'm going to do for my employment. I don't know how I'm going to earn my money, so why bother thinking about that? We never take that attitude. We do, even though there's some uncertainty, we do our best to plan and to steer our future in the direction that that we'd like. So it might or might not work. So it might be that we end up in our dream work situation. It might be that we go from one series of unpleasant jobs to another, but it's more likely that it's going to work out, that it's going to be closer to what we'd prefer if we put in some sort of planning. So we don't sort of simply say, well, I don't know, so why even think about it? So similarly with our future after this life ends. Likewise, we really don't know when we're younger. We don't know if we're going to have kids or not. We don't know what our relationship is going to be like, but we don't sort of think, well, I'm just not going to put any effort into thinking about that at all. We still try to apply at some level our wisdom, our judgment, our feelings to steer us in a positive direction. And so it's the same way in dealing with the uncertainty of what will happen at the end of this life. It's useful to do some forward, at least to do some forward thinking about that. It also isn't useful to have the attitude, well, I don't want to think about what might happen at the end of this life because I might be in an unpleasant situation. It might be that my future life is much less pleasant than this one. So there's no way that I want to think about that. But again, that's also not a useful way to approach it. So for example, if we live in a bushfire zone, and Euroke is sometimes in a marginal bushfire zone, we don't sort of simply say, well, the thought of there being a bushfire, that's so bad, that's so scary that I just don't want to think about it at all. I'm just not going to put in any effort to thinking about that. Instead, if we're sensible, we have a bushfire plan. So we organise our palm, we slash the grass, we have a plan to say or in the event that the scary adverse circumstance of a bushfire happens. So it's similar to that in contemplating the possibilities of a future rebirth, having some sort of plan, or at least some advanced thinking about it, is rational, not least because of the fact that the situation that we're in mightn't be pleasant, or has the potential not to be pleasant. So from that point of view, doing what we can to avoid those unpleasant conditions is as sensible as having a bushfire plan. It's much healthier, and this is really true of most, maybe all teachings of the path to enlightenment, to face facts, to align our perspective closer with the reality of our actual position. The facts in this case are that we're definitely going to die, and we don't know what will happen from direct experience, but nonetheless, we do know that this life is going to end. That comes back to one of the more general points about the motivation of small scope. So as we mentioned before and last week, if we actually, or at the point that we actually have the realization of the small scope, that the test of that, the criterion of that, as explained in Path to Enlightenment, is that from our heart, genuinely, no faking, we're more interested in our future life than, and in the happiness of our future life than we are in the happiness or circumstances of this life. So last week after the class, one of the people in the class who may or may not have been Pam made the point, which I think is a really good one, that standing back and looking at that, one of the challenges for us of really and particularly for those of us who come from a Western cultural background, one of the challenges for us in really relate to this idea of being more interested in our future life than we are in this life is that we generally don't have a really strong conviction, a strong sense day to day that our future life exists, that we're going to have a future life. So at one level you might say, well, that's self-evident because of course we don't have the realisation of the small scope, and so it's not surprising that we don't have that urgent natural sense that our future life exists. But still, we shouldn't brush that sense off. We shouldn't sort of simply think, well, I do find it hard to generate a heartfelt, genuine conviction that I have a future life, but I should suppress that because given that all the Buddhist texts take it as a given and given that all the lamas take it as a given, therefore I wouldn't be, I'm not practicing Buddhism properly if I allow myself to even feel that way or to even ask that question. So that sort of attitude of not investigating or thinking that we need to feel or think in a particular way and not to work through the way that we actually feel and the way that we actually perceive things, that's actually directly contrary to Buddha's method. So Geshe Loden often quotes the Abhidharma Sutra where the Buddha said, and I don't have the exact words with me because I don't believe this text is extracted in Path to Enlightenment, although it is in the Great Treasury of Mahamudra. But the gist of it is, monks and scholars well analyse my words, just as gold is tested by rubbing, cutting and burning, then accept them, but not for the sake of respect. So in approaching any subject of the Path to Enlightenment, including the subject of future lives, then we need to analyse them carefully. We need to directly and honestly work through our own thinking about them to analyse what logic we're coming from, the extent to which our own perspective reflects our own habits or backgrounds, but really to work down through the logic. And only if the logic makes sense to us, we have a connection with that, then we accept the teachings, not simply because it's in a book or because it's in a sutra or because a teacher has told us that this is the case. The only way that we develop the realizations of the Path to Enlightenment genuinely is through the developing the wisdoms of listening, thinking, and meditation. And so there's no way of fast forwarding that process. We need to work through that. So in the I mentioned Geshe Loden does quote that the Abhidharma, or that verse from the Abhidharma Sutra in the Great Treasury of Mahamudra, and in his commentary there, he explains that with the analogy of gold being tested firstly by rubbing it, cutting it, and burning it, that those three correspond to the different types of cognizer, or the different ways in which we can know and develop our knowledge of different phenomena, such as in this case, our future rebirth, for example. So just backing up a bit, I guess people get the example from the sutra. So the example is, if you're going to buy gold from a gold merchant, if you hand over your hard-earned just for something that looks shiny and yellow-coloured, then there's a good chance that you're going to be ripped off. So the way that you figure out for yourself whether or not this gold is the genuine article, traditionally it was said that firstly you would rub the gold Secondly, you would make a small incision into the gold to make sure that it was gold all the way through. And finally, you'd put the gold into the fire. And it was only if you'd taken those 3 steps that you could be satisfied, that you could be confident that this really was the genuine article, and then you could buy it with confidence and hand over your money. And so in the same way, we need to test and analyse the Buddha's teachings, because when we think about it, if we're just talking about buying gold, the worst that can happen if we don't check it properly is that we're ripped off and we lose some money. The question of our future happiness, of our future rebirths, is much more profound than any question of whether or not we do a good deal on purchasing some gold. And so for that reason, we need to put a lot of energy into carefully checking and analysing the teachings of the path to enlightenment. And this process itself develops our wisdom. So Geshe Loden mentions that these methods correspond to different types of what are referred to as valid cognizers. And what valid cognizers referred to is really a method of knowing something in a reliable way. And so there are generally 3, sometimes 4, but in Great Treasury of Mahamudra, Geshe talks about 3 types of valid cognizer. So what that means is that if we're using this type of approach to understanding something, well then it can lead to a valid and correct conclusion. So these correspond to rubbing, cutting, and burning the gold. So the first is a direct cognizer. So an example of that is we see a fire. So we see the fire, we know the fire is there because we see it. And an object that we know through a direct cognizer, or a direct valid cognizer as it's sometimes called, is known as a manifest phenomenon. So with our eye consciousness, we look, we see our fire, then we're knowing it through a direct valid cognizer, and the object, the fire, is a manifest phenomenon. Secondly, we mightn't see the fire, but we see the smoke. And we know through seeing the smoke that the fire exists. So so the way that we know that is through inference, through an inferential cognizer. And again, there are different labels, but I think Geshe Loden uses the term an inferential cognizer through the power of fact. And in that case, the fire that we know exists as a result of seeing the smoke is known as a slightly hidden phenomenon. So it's a hidden phenomenon. We don't perceive it. We don't perceive the fire directly by perceiving the smoke, but still we know it's there through this type of inference. The third type of cognizer is an inferential cognizer through belief, and we gain valid knowledge through an inferential cognizer through the power of belief, or faith it's sometimes called, where we have information from somebody who is reliable. So we mightn't see the fire, we mightn't see the smoke, but a reliable person tells us that there's a fire happening somewhere, and because that person we know to be completely reliable, that they wouldn't say that just for nothing, then we know that the fire exists. And a phenomenon that we know that way, through that type of cognizer, through an inferential cognizer through the power of belief, then we can perceive either slightly hidden phenomena or very hidden phenomena. So for example, an example of a very hidden phenomenon is the individual workings of karma. So from a Buddhist point of view, all of our experience is attributable ultimately to the ripening of particular karmas. But it's only a Buddha who could tell it. The only way that we could know without being enlightened ourselves what particular karmic cause is ripening in our current experience would be a Buddha, would be somebody who has neither the obscurations of liberation nor the obscurations to omniscience. So something that is only knowable, that is extremely subtle, and is only knowable in that way and not through reasoning, is a very hidden phenomenon. So getting back to this question of future lives. So we might think that we might generally think, if we do, that we really only know something if we see it, believing. But that isn't really the case. We can see that actually most of the things that we know in our day-to-day experience, some of them relate, some of them we know directly, but most of the things that we experience and know are based on the use of the other types of cognizer. A few years back, when we had a grass fire at Euroke, I looked out the window, I saw this huge, in my bedroom, I saw this huge wall of smoke coming down the road, and I knew that there was a fire. So I didn't see any fire, didn't see any flames, but there'd be a fire. There was no doubt that the fact that I hadn't seen the flames was beside the point. An absolutely clear, urgent sense, oh my goodness, we have a fire, we need to call the fire brigade. Even if I hadn't seen that smoke, but somebody else at the centre had said to me, hey, there's a fire coming down Cook's Road, again, I would know. Even though I hadn't seen the fire, I hadn't seen the smoke, I would have a valid cognizer based on belief, because I would know very well that the person who said that to me wasn't making it up. I would have a valid cognizer based on belief that the fire actually existed. So, for example, if that person said that to me, and then somebody else, I saw somebody else 60 seconds later, and they said, hey, Martin, there's a fire down Cook's Road, I would say, I know. So I haven't seen the fire, haven't seen the smoke, but I know, because based on a valid cognizer, a valid inferential cognizer based on belief. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has another really nice and famous example of the last sort of a valid cognizer based on belief. So he asks, do you know your birthday? So most of us, or I think everybody, will probably answer yes to that question, but how do you know your birthday, and how could you know your birthday? It's not like the moment we popped out into this world, we looked at a calendar and made a note of the date of the date that we were born. It's only because we have that information from a reliable source that we're able to actually say that we know our birthday. So all of this is quite important in getting an understanding of how we would get a better sense of the existence or otherwise of our future lives. So going back to the terminology of the valid cognizers, at the moment, our future life is a hidden phenomenon. So we can't see it directly at the moment, although from a Buddhist point of view, if we had clairvoyance, certain types of clairvoyance, then we would be able to see it. It would no longer be a hidden phenomenon, but rather a manifest phenomenon. But unless anybody has those powers, then our future life at the moment is a hidden phenomenon. It can only be known through the power of inference. So that might be through inference based on factual evidence or factual reasoning. So, for example, we might speak to somebody who has had a near-death experience, and we might hear what they say, we might make an evaluation of whether the person's reliable, we might compare what they say with other accounts that we've heard of the death process and what happens after death, and that might help us form an inference as to whether or not we believe future lives exist. There's also other evidence we can consider, other evidence of reincarnation that we can consider, and particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, there's the information about the rebirth of tulkus or incarnate lamas. So as an example of that, one Western monk who I met was telling me a story about he was previously an attendant to a very high lama in India, and he used to among the things he used to do was to drive that lama around either India or it might have been Kathmandu actually, and it was a really battered up car, and the monk said that the lama would often take him around the car and point out all the dings in the Duco and say, oh, you need to go off and get this fixed and get this and get it painted properly. And this monk sort of said, oh yeah, he'll do that, but he never actually got around to it. Then this lama passed away, and several years later, then the lama's reincarnation was identified, and this monk, on one of the early occasions that he met this young incarnate lama, then the young boy took him by the hand and up to the same car that he used to drive the previous lama around, and pointed out all of the dings in the Duco and gave him a big smile at the time. So again, there are stories or accounts like that that might also help us to form a view as to the likelihood of future rebirths. We can also apply introspection. So one of the reasonings that's used to help us approach the idea of the continuity of our mind, or of, and in particular of our future rebirths, is to reflect on the fact that in our current life, every moment of mind comes from a previous moment of mind. There's no moment in our experience where that continuity is broken. So there's no moment of mind in all of the years we've been on this earth, at least that we know of, where our existence, where our consciousness suddenly sprang into existence without there having been a previous moment of experience that gave rise to it. And that conditions, we can see this moment to moment. Our feelings in one moment spill over into our feelings in the next moment. If we contemplate the continuity of mind in that way, that one moment of mind always seems to come from somewhere and always seems to lead to a subsequent moment of mind, that can also give us a stronger sense of the continuity of our current consciousness from the moment of a previous life, and also its continuation into the moments of mind of a future consciousness or of a future life. Again, this doesn't establish past or future lives as a matter of logic or evidence if we approach it simply that way, but it gives us a stronger sense of the continuity of mind that makes that type of inference easier to understand. Another argument that I've heard that also mentioned last week after the class, that I heard one teacher point out, is that if we look around us, there's no phenomenon that we can think of or identify that ceases, and when it ceases leaves no residue. There's nothing behind it whatsoever. And we can also apply that to our consciousness. So we can also ask, if no other phenomenon, nothing else that we can conceive of, nothing else that we're familiar with, nothing else that we can imagine, when it ends without leaving any residue whatsoever, then how is it plausible that that could be the case with our mind, with our continuity of consciousness? So these are the sorts of These are the sorts of things, the sorts of inferences that we can contemplate in order to get a better sense of the possibility of future rebirths. And also, of course, there's inference through the power of belief. So we can listen to the teachings of those who we have a real conviction, understand and know what they're talking about with this type of subject. So if, for example, we find that the teachings of Guru Shakyamuni Buddha and other teachings make so much sense in the other areas of our life, then that gives us greater confidence that when they teach about subjects that we're not so familiar with, that there's a likelihood that they also know what they're talking about when, for example, they're teaching about subjects such as rebirth. So, for example, I have always found that one of the things to Buddhism was the fact that its description of the mind, its description of the way our positive and negative minds work, was something that really enabled me to make sense of my own experience and of the behaviour of others, and that it described those in a way that was much more complete, much more intuitive than many of the descriptions, for example, that were set out in Western psychology. And so for me, that meant, and it means, that when I receive teachings on subjects that I can't verify directly from my own experience, that I'm disposed to be open to them, because the bits that I can make sense of and verify from my own experience really seem to be spot on. Also, we can generate this observation, we can generate this understanding by observing our own teachers. So it was crystal clear to me from my observation of Geshe Loden that he had no doubt whatsoever, no question, that we have a future life, that our consciousness, our mind doesn't end at the beginning of this life, at the end of this life, and that after this life is ended, that we continue to have experiences, that we continue to experience the effects of our positive and negative minds. So when Geshe would talk about this, when he would give these subjects, there was no hint of dogmatism about it. Now, if people are dogmatic about a subject, then you can usually pick that up quite easily, because they get defensive if you challenge them. They have a real emotional investment in you believing them, and they become really uncomfortable if people have a different view. The Geshe would present the teachings on death, impermanence, lower realms, karma, and so forth, but he gave no sense whatsoever if people accepted them or not. He certainly, and in fact quite the reverse, he adopted the exact recommendation that we talked about before from the Abhidhamma Sutra. He said, you check up for yourself. If this teaching is for you, if it's good logic, if it's valuable to you, then you can practice it. If to you it is not logical, then not necessary. Then don't practice it. You do what's useful. So this gives us a basis for using our wisdoms of listening, thinking, and meditation to develop our own understanding of this subject. So our future lives, our rebirth, are a hidden object. As with any hidden object, the only way that we can approach it is to use our inferential cognizers to form our view or understanding of it. But from a Buddhist point of view, ultimately, if we achieve the realizations of the path, then our understanding of future rebirths changes from being a hidden phenomenon to a phenomenon that we can directly perceive. That is, it becomes a manifest object. So going back then to the subject of rebirth in particular. So Buddhism's own position about this is quite clear. So from a Buddhist point of view, when this life ends, our body disintegrates, but our mind continues. Our mental continuum still exists at that point. So if we put that aside for a moment and just think about, so go back to basics. So what are the things that could happen at the point that this life ends in terms of our mind? So there are two possibilities. The first is that our mental continuum ceases completely. That's a theoretical possibility. The second possibility is that our mental continuum goes on, that it isn't fully terminated at the time that we die from this life. So the first theoretical possibility is that our mental continuum ceases, that it's all over. So some might say that that's a pretty pessimistic or bleak view, but at least I guess it would mean that we didn't have anything to worry about and couldn't do anything about it. Some see that view as a more rational or scientific belief. In fact, I think that's probably a very common view amongst people in Western cultures generally. So some people, even without thinking about it, so if you just stopped them in the street and asked them, they would probably feel that any sort of belief that there might be life after death is really just some sort of made-up fantasy, that people just think that because it makes them feel better, that there isn't really any direct evidence for it, and so therefore it probably doesn't exist. That attitude isn't actually, although people tend to think that it's more scientific or rational or logical, it's actually no more scientific, rational or logical than the alternative view, because we can just as easily say, well, there's absolutely no evidence that our mental activity ceases at the time of death. And there are some traditions, including Buddhism, including Hinduism, including most religions, would say that it's a made-up fantasy to think that our consciousness is simply extinguished at the time of death. So we may not, so getting back to the language that we used before, the fact that we can't perceive our next life via a direct valid cognizer at the moment, logically that doesn't mean and doesn't imply that we mightn't be able to perceive it using a direct cognizer or an inferential cognizer after further logic and examination, or from possibly from direct experience. So generally, and I know I'm really oversimplifying here, but in scientific method, we have a working approach known as Occam's razor. So again, really simplifying. It says, well, if there are two possible explanations for something, then generally what you should do is go for the simplest explanation first. But that's just a working approach to try and understand phenomena. It's not proof of whether something actually exists or not. For example, several centuries ago, nobody in Europe knew of the existence of the Australian continent. So some people in Europe speculated that there was a great Southland, but there was no evidence for it whatsoever. So from the point of view of the people in Europe at that time, it was a hidden phenomenon. If you applied the scientific method that we talked about, well, then you would say, well, there's no evidence for the existence of the Great Southland. So the more scientific conclusion is that there isn't, in fact, a Great Southland on the southern side of the world. In fact, the Australian continent was here whether Europeans at the time could prove it or not, we can perceive it with a direct valid cognizer or not, it would simply be a fact. The self of our future life doesn't care whether the self of our current life believes in the existence of future lives or not. So does our mental continuum continue or not? So again, we need to approach this directly from the basics of rubbing, burning and cutting and so forth. And unless we do have realizations, then from our direct personal experience right now, we can't say whether we have a future life or not. For us right now, it is a hidden phenomenon. There's no direct evidence for it, although there's the type of indirect or anecdotal evidence that we talked about before, and it could help us build an inferential cognition. But neither possibility of a future rebirth or a non-future rebirth based on this type of analysis is more logical than the other, although Buddhist scholars would actually say that that logic supports the existence of future rebirths. If we come from a Western culture, we might feel that belief in rebirth is outlandish or fantastic, but largely that simply reflects our cultural background, because it hasn't been part, belief in reincarnation or future lives hasn't been largely part of our mainstream cultural background. Around, well, or more than 1 billion who have been brought up in other cultures, such as Hindu cultures or Buddhist cultures, simply accept rebirth as a cultural assumption. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they're right. It's no more valid for the fact that it's simply an assumption, but the fact that the idea of rebirth feels fantastic to us, or can feel fantastic to people from a Western cultural background, doesn't weigh in one way or the other as to whether or not that's actually a valid perception. So the way we approach this is to investigate more and more, and if we do that through our process of listening, wisdom and thinking, well then our own impression, our own feelings about it progressively become clearer. But we do know that there are two possibilities at the end of this life. So there are two logical possibilities. The first is that it's completely the end of the story, or that our mental continuum goes on at the end of our life. Can we, the question that we have to really think about from a practical point of view is whether or not we can honestly, clearly and incontrovertibly say that the first is the only possibility, that can we really be convinced that there's no doubt whatsoever that our mental continuum ceases at the end of this life, or would we reach the conclusion that the second that our mental continuum goes on is a logical and pragmatic possibility? If the first was the only possibility, then, like I mentioned before, in some ways it's easy, it's a bit bleak. We certainly can't do anything about it. And how we would respond to that, to the thought that our mental continuum ceases, really depends on our own values and outlook, and how we would make sense of that. Because the second is at least a possibility, because there's at least a possibility that our mental continuum continues in our next life, then we need to think about because just as in the course of this life, we take account of things that are real risks, real possibilities, then likewise, that suggests that if we're smart, we start thinking about the implications of that possibility, the implications of the fact, the implications of the possibility that when our life ends, our mind will continue, and what we will experience then, and what our thoughts will be, and how we should respond to that. So that's probably a reasonable place to leave off for now. We'll do a short meditation, and after that, if anybody has any questions, we'll leave a little bit of time for that. But for now, we'll do just a brief breathing meditation. So allowing our attention to gather inward, releasing all external objects, sight, sounds, and so forth. Also releasing any mental wandering. Memories of the past. Thoughts or plans about the future. Allowing our mind to settle, stabilize and center on just one object. The natural rise and fall of our breath. So not trying to breathe in any special way. Just quietly observing the natural rise and fall of our breath. If we find that our attention has wandered, on becoming aware of that, simply gently restore our focus to the breath. Okay, so we have time for that. The other thing, I'm thinking about how to approach this subject of, and particularly the meditations on the subjects of the lower realms. So when I think about it, Geshe Loden would give teachings on this subject, but he wouldn't actually lead detailed meditations on the experiences of the lower realms, even though he describes them here in the book, at least as far as I can recall. And I've also looked at the approach taken by some other teachers, and on some occasions they simply do a silent meditation whereby people can familiarise themselves with the description and do it for themselves. So what I think I'll do is talk about the various types of lower realm in general terms. I certainly won't go into detailed meditation on the details of them. I've reread this chapter myself in the last week, and I'll actually do that again in the next week. I would encourage you, and I will myself, actually do some of these meditations myself, even if we do some meditation for a short period on the types of experience in the various types of lower realm. But that's really up to you. And as I mentioned before, whether or not we feel comfortable, sufficiently mentally robust to do that is up to us. But I've certainly found in the past that it's useful to do some of this meditation for a short time. Apart from anything else, it also reinforces our understanding of our own current conditions of leisure and fortune when we're free of the gross difficulties of the three types of lower realm. Anyway, so that's my suggestion about how we might approach it. But I'll probably talk about them in fairly general terms when we get at the next class, which will hopefully be from the temple next week. So there haven't been any questions, so we might then go straight, thank you, Manikam. So we might go straight into the dedication prayers. So we will do the final prayer of the graduated path in English. By the two collections, vast as space, amassed with effort for a long time, may I become a chief of conquerors, a guide for all beings whose mind's eye is blinded by ignorance. Also in all lives, while not yet come to that, may Manjushri favour me with his compassion, finding the supreme path, complete with all stages of the teachings, may I please the conquerors by practising well. By my precise understanding of the essential points of the path, with skillful means drawn along by strong compassion, and by dispelling the mental darkness of beings, may I uphold the conqueror's teaching for a long time. Where the supreme precious teaching has not spread, also where it has spread but become degenerate, with a mind deeply moved by great compassion, may I make clear this treasure of benefit and bliss. The stages of the path, excellently established by the marvellous deeds of the conquerors and their sons, give glory to the minds of those aspiring for liberation. May the conquerors' deeds be long preserved. May all humans and non-humans who remove the obstructions and establish conditions favourable to cultivating the excellent path never be parted for all of their lifetimes from the purest of paths which the Buddhas have praised. When someone makes effort to practice properly the 10 points of conduct of the Supreme Vehicle, may he always be assisted by the mighty protectors, and may oceans of good fortune spread out, reaching all. And then the general dedication. By this virtue, may all beings complete the collections of wisdom and merit, and attain the two holy bodies arisen from wisdom and merit. May the precious, superior mind of enlightenment be generated in those who have not yet generated it, and not decrease in those who have developed it, but increase continuously. Thank you. Marnikin did pass through a question from Kat. So thanks for that, Kat. Sorry, I was too quick off the block. So what will happen? I'll get a copy of that, and I'll cover that next week, if that's okay. Otherwise, everybody have a wonderful week. Do stay safe, and hopefully we'll be back in the temple. Thank you very much. Have a great week. See you later. Okay, bye.